If you were born between 1976 and 1985, your mindset is completely different from everyone else. You're not Gen X, and you're not Millennial either. So what are you? You grew up analog, you became digital, and somewhere in between, you built a version of yourself that doesn't quite fit any box the world prepared for you. There's actually a name for this. Researchers call it the Xennial microgeneration. And once you understand the psychology behind it, a lot of things about how you think, how you relate to people, and why you feel chronically in between start to make a different kind of sense. You didn't grow up with the internet. You grew up with boredom. Long summers with nothing but your own imagination, a bicycle, and maybe a VHS tape you watched 40 times. You learned how to sit with yourself, how to fill silence, how to exist without stimulation on demand. That wired something into you. Then, somewhere in your late teens or early 20s, the internet arrived. And instead of being handed it as children, the way younger millennials were, you had to adapt to it as a forming adult. You learned it consciously. You made a choice to engage with it. That distinction matters more than it sounds. People who grew up with technology from childhood often have a different relationship with it. It's ambient, it's constant, it's identity. But you remember the before. You have a reference point that most people online today simply don't have. You know what it felt like to wait, to be unreachable, to not know something and just live with not knowing. That's not nostalgia. That's a cognitive architecture that's genuinely different. Now, here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Every generation develops an identity partly through contrast. You know who you are because you can see who you're not. Gen X had that clearly. Millennials had that clearly. But Xennials, you sat right at the edge of both worlds, and the contrast never fully resolved. You were too young to fully claim Gen X's detachment and irony, but you were too old to identify with the millennial experience of coming of age online, of growing up in a world that was already connected. So what happens psychologically when your generational identity doesn't have a clean container? You internalize a kind of ambiguity. You become comfortable existing in the in-between, not fully committing to one cultural identity, one aesthetic, one way of seeing the world. And on the surface, that can look like being well-rounded, adaptable, easy to talk to. But underneath, a lot of Xennials describe this quiet feeling of never quite belonging to either camp. You can talk to older Gen X colleagues and hold your own. You can navigate with younger millennials and keep up, but you don't feel fully seen by either group. That's not a flaw. That's what happens when you grow up at a cultural seam.
And here's where it gets even more specific. Because of this in-between positioning, many Xennials developed a particular psychological trait, a kind of dual fluency, the ability to read rooms across very different generational contexts. You learned early that you couldn't assume shared references. You learned to code switch culturally before that was even a term people used casually. But dual fluency has a hidden cost. When you're always the one translating, always the one who can go either way, always the one who bridges, you can lose track of where you actually land. Not in a crisis way, more like a quiet, chronic uncertainty about your own cultural home base. Some Xennials describe it as feeling like an observer in most rooms, present, engaged, perceptive, but with a thin, invisible glass between themselves and full belonging. And this isn't just a social pattern. It shows up in how Xennials approach work, relationships, and technology. At work, Xennials often become the unofficial translators between leadership, who may be boomers or older Gen X, and younger staff who communicate and think differently. It seems like a strength, and it is. But it can also mean you're carrying relational labor that nobody formally assigned to you. In relationships, Xennials often hold a kind of emotional bilingualism too. You were raised with older emotional norms. Don't talk too much about feelings, be self-sufficient, figure it out quietly. But you came of age just as emotional literacy started becoming culturally valued. So you understand both languages, but you don't always feel fluent in either. There's something else worth naming. Xennials came of age during a specific sequence of disruptions: the dot-com crash, September 11th, the 2008 financial crisis. These weren't distant historical events. They were the backdrop of your early career, your first attempts at building stability. And what that does, psychologically, is create what researchers sometimes call adaptive pessimism. Not cynicism exactly, but a grounded, preemptive awareness that things can fall apart. You don't plan for the best-case scenario the way purely optimistic cultures sometimes do. You plan for the real scenario, and you leave room for disruption. That's not a negative trait. It's actually a form of psychological resilience that's been earned, not learned. But it can look, from the outside, like guardedness, like you're slow to fully trust, like there's always a part of you that's quietly asking, what's the catch? Not from paranoia, but from experience. And here's what's important to understand about that pattern. It wasn't a choice. It was a rational response to a world that kept proving itself unpredictable during your most formative years. That's not pessimism, it's pattern recognition.
There's one more layer that defines Xennials in a way that's rarely talked about directly. Your relationship with technology is chosen, not inherited. You remember what the world was before constant connection. You made an active decision, consciously or not, about how much to let technology into your identity. That's genuinely rare now. Most people alive today cannot access a pre-internet selfhood. You can. That gives you something unusual. The ability to notice when the online world is pulling you somewhere you don't actually want to go. You have an internal reference point. You know what it felt like to have an unwitnessed life, and part of you still values that, which is why many Xennials feel a particular kind of exhaustion with social media, not because they can't use it, but because they remember the texture of life before the performance of it, before curating, before the audience. You didn't grow up needing to be watched to feel real. And some part of you has never entirely let go of that. So this is the psychology of the Xennial. Not quite Gen X, not quite Millennial, but shaped by the exact collision point between two fundamentally different eras and carrying the internal architecture that comes from navigating both: the dual fluency, the adaptive resilience, the quiet observer's distance, the chosen relationship with technology, the ambiguity of never quite having a cultural home base that fully fits. None of that was random. It was the product of a very specific window in time, a very specific set of pressures, and a very specific way of having to build an identity without a clear generational map to follow. Once you see that pattern in yourself, it reads differently. Not as being in between, but as being formed by the in-between, which is a completely different thing. It was never about not fitting in. It was about what gets built in people who learn early that fitting in completely was never really an option, and that awareness alone changes how you see yourself.